Hello, everyone. This is part one of session 8 of Pre-Socratics to Augustine, also called History of Philosophy 1. We are still discussing Plato's Euthyphro, but today's recording starts rather than ends with the little homework puzzle that I always have for you. And the reason is that I want to explain a kind of famously difficult dimension of Plato's dialogues. And in a way, it's easiest to understand that problem if you sort of put yourself in the shoes of someone who is Socrates' interlocutor. And that's also what I ask you to do for the homework puzzle. So suppose someone, Socrates, asks you one of these what is X questions. What is the pious, as in the Euthyphro? It could also be what is justice. It could be what is courage. Some positive quality, something that you think is a good feature to have. And then you might think, I want to know what it is. And that is a common feature of a lot of Platonic dialogues. Now, we already saw that a certain kind of answer to this question, namely to offer an example, is, according to Socrates, not a good reply. Now, in the section of the text that we are now reading, which is very famous and kind of called the Euthyphro problem, and we will talk about more specifics regarding the Euthyphro problem in the next recording. In that section, we start from Euthyphro's third attempt to define the pious, and that third attempt sets aside disagreement among the gods, and he just says, okay, so what is pious? Here's my new proposal. What is pious is what all the gods love. So a shorter formulation of that then is the pious is the god loved. And in response to that, Socrates says, well, you didn't give me the nature or the what it is or the being, and in Greek, the Ousia of piety. Instead, you gave me a Pathos. That's a Greek term which has very broad meaning. You gave me a quality of the pious. That is maybe one of the ways how the pious is, that it is God love, but that is not what the pious is. So here's a distinction between what something is. When we ask one of these what is X questions, we want to know what something is. And that's not the same, Socrates says, as the question how something is. So the assignment that I have for you, and I'll say a little more in a moment about how it works in the Euthyphro, but the assignment that I have for you is you put yourself in the shoes of an interlocutor of Socrates who has to offer replies to one of these what is X questions. And you're not supposed to give an example. And you're also not supposed to say how something is. What is your other option, or is there another option? That's the question for you to think about. That is a truly hard question. And I want to talk a little more now about the Euthyphro in order to explain in which sense, why one might think that is really a hard question. There is a famous paper by Pious from 1966, which argues that the kind of dialogue that, the Euthyphro is paradigmatic for involves a fallacy, that Plato really lets Socrates stand for a view or position that is a mistake. And the mistake is to think that if you ask what something is, then you're not supposed to be able to give any examples for it, such that to give an example for it just isn't at all a valuable way of addressing the question of what something is. And Pious argued, and that was influenced by discussions at the time also that related to Wittgenstein's work. The thought was that actually examples are like a really, really good tool in philosophy. If you want to understand something, why not start with an example? And then you might think, isn't that exactly what we were saying about the structure of the Euthyphro? Socrates and Euthyphro run into each other at the courthouse. And we hear about the cases that they are dealing with. And so the text actually starts with three examples of disagreement. And then we get an analysis of disagreement. So why is Plato saying that examples aren't a good way to address some topic in philosophy? That is a truly difficult question. And I want you to think about it sort of with respect to the specific problem that Plato addresses in the Euthyphro. Because if we look a little more closely, we see that Socrates isn't really saying that it's impossible to give any kind of example for what would be pious. Rather, the claim is that as long as we don't have a model, a paradigma, as long as we don't know what the pious is, which would help us, which would serve us as a model, we cannot assess particular cases. So it may be possible that you can give a general example. For example, you might say, being reverent toward divinity, that's an example for being pious. But being able to say that would not yet enable you to assess a particular action as pious or impious. That is the specific problem that the Euthyphro is about. So you might think that is the reason why examples are problematic, but it still leaves some space for examples in philosophy. The other option that I mentioned a moment ago, when Euthyphro says the pious is the God-loved, and Socrates says, well, God-loved is merely a quality of the pious. It's merely like how the pious is. It's not what the pious is. You might again think, well, maybe that is not too bad. Why should we think that when we want to understand something, then we shouldn't start by asking how it is? So it's a really difficult question. We'll talk more about that in the next recording. Why talking about qualities of something, like how something is, why that isn't quite the same as talking about what it is. But for now, the assignment just is, if you're not supposed to either give an example or to say how something is, how then are you even going to start to address one of these what is X questions?